over immediately to Carol, just mentioning that this talk is supported by the W.B. Yeats Chair, let's say that in English, Cadeira W.B. Yeats, the Departamento de Letras Modernas, and CITRA, Centro de Terminologia e Tradução, and two postgraduate courses, the Estudos da Tradução course and the course Língua Inglesa e Literaturas de Língua Inglesa.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for the invitation to come to Sao Paulo. It's my first time in Brazil, and also to the University of Sao Paulo for inviting me and supporting this visit. So I know that you have many languages here in the university. Today we will touch on French, Chinese, Irish, and German, I think. So I know this will leave out many important languages, the most important of which is Portuguese, which I'm afraid I speak not at all, and I apologize for that. So first, can I ask, can you hear me?
Yes.
If you stop being able to hear me, please wave. So I'm talking about film, and I know there are a number of colleagues here with an interest in film. And the idea behind this paper was to think through some films which I have over the years found very interesting, which seem to have something to say about cultural identity and language and also translation. So I'm going to be talking about two films here today in very brief terms. So from the beginning of its history, film has functioned as a locus for the discussion of cultural identity. Even before the arrival of sound in 1927, film reflected on the languages that characters spoke and on their cultural and their national allegiances. So I have a couple of examples here. This is from the 1927 silent film Barbed Wire, starring Paula Negri. And we have a dialogue title, an intertitle, where a character speaks French and it is dissolved into English. So there's this dissolve effect in the intertitle. So it dissolves from the language in which the character is speaking in the story to the language of the audience, of the assumed audience, the language of the film's making. And this dissolved translation is very common in silent film and in the early sound period. On the subject of language and cultural identity, we could also cite this film from 1913 by D.W. Griffith called The Battle at Elderbush Gulch, a short western, in which one intertitle slide purports to represent Native American dialogue translated into English. So we are told that Wana Watinke must be some kind of language of one of the Native American tribes, and then an English translation is immediately given. So thus immediately we have a them and an us linguistically constituted in the narrative. Scott Mackenzie and Meta Hjert, in their very important books on cinema and nation, have observed that films don't simply represent or express the stable features of a national culture. They are themselves one of the loci of debates about a nation's governing principles, goals, heritage, and history. And one of the elements, very important elements of this debate is language. Both of these intertitles from silent films reify the foreign language through written representation, and they invoke an assumed audience, which has an assumed target language. So they show one of the ways in which film can take part in debates about national identity. And we could talk maybe about some of the problems which sound film particularly brought for this, but we can wait till afterwards. So I'm going today to develop this idea. I'm going to try to connect subtitling, multilingualism, and identity, and through an analysis of language use and translation in two short films, which we could classify under the heading of language fantasy. I don't think this is yet a Hollywood mainstream genre, but someday it may be. So I'm going to try and show how subtitling can facilitate a multilingual reflection on issues of identity and belonging, but at the same time, multilingualism is a challenge for subtitling, a technical challenge, and thus a challenge for the representation of identity in film. Okay, so let's start by recapping a few things that we know about subtitles. So they aim to be unobtrusive, they aim not to be noticed, they want to facilitate the fastest and smoothest possible reading, they're very carefully composed, they're very consistent in presentation, punctuation, layout, they use a hyper-correct form of the standard language, and they try to avoid error. And all of this is in order to make it easier to understand and in order not to be noticed. And we have some examples there which we can go back to if we need to. Okay, they compress the verbal material in the film. So a reading speed can be very slow television reading speed, maybe 120 words per minute. Fast DVD or cinema reading speed, 180 words per minute. And they would expect to omit on that basis between 30 and 50% of the actual verbal material in the film. So all phatic speech, repetitions, I don't know, people's names, background speech, overlapping dialogue, all of that tends to disappear through compression and paraphrase. And this presents enormous problems for translation. And Henrik Gottlieb, in an important article on subtitling, which lists all the strategies that a translator can use, includes decimation, deletion, and ultimately resignation. So translators sometimes just give up. Okay, subtitles constitute what has been called a complex rhetorical intrusion into a film. So you've got this very rhythmic intervention in the film, the appearance of these titles. They never last less than a second. They never last longer than 6 seconds. They always have to have a certain number of frames of gap between the subtitles. And the result is that each film acquires a certain rhythm through the subtitling. And there's a great example, for those of you who know, I don't know if you know the Ubu site with experimental literature and film, but there's a sound work by Alan Licht where he put a group of people in a room and they watched Rashomon, Kurosawa's Rashomon, with the sound turned down, and they read the subtitles. So all you hear in this sound work is the sound of a small, very embarrassed group of people reading a series of subtitles, and you really hear this rhythm that you get in a subtitled film. Okay, we're going to skip that bit. This is an important thing that I just wanted to mention. David McDougall, the documentary filmmaker, who was one of the people responsible for introducing subtitles to documentary film in the early 1970s, is skeptical. He sees subtitles as a huge advance on dubbing or voicing over the voices in a documentary, but he says at the same time, subtitlers risk inducing in viewers a false sense of cultural affinity. We go to the cinema, we see a subtitled film, and we have this feeling that we're watching the real film, and we have access to the real film, and it hasn't been changed. It's just got the subtitles over it. And this is not quite true, because films can also be heavily edited as well as subtitled, and this does happen. So subtitles can reinforce an impression that we can have access to everything. All we need to do is subtitle it, and we have it, we know it. So subtitles can create a fuller sense of the humanity of strangers, but they can also contribute to a complacency about those strangers. They sustain a belief in the ability of our society to turn everything found in the world to our use. And I don't know if any of you have used the subtitling facility on YouTube, the Google Translate subtitling facility, but this suggests that we are not yet there at being able to access everything that's out there just because we want to. So David McDougall is somebody I really recommend for those of you interested in subtitling. He writes some of the best work that I've read on the topic. Okay, so the two films I'm looking at. The first one is called You Ming Is Anam Dum, also known as My Name Is You Ming. It is an Irish, or this is an Irish sentence, meaning my name is You Ming, and I'm going to refer to this as the film's title. It's a 3-minute short film released in 2003 and directed by Daniel O'Hara, a young Irish filmmaker. And it tells the story of Yu Ming, an immigrant to Ireland, who prepares for his move to Ireland by learning the national language of the country, which is Irish. But when he arrives in Ireland, he discovers that the linguistic situation is not what he expected. The second short film, which is about 20 minutes, is called Desperanto. Let me just see if I got it here. Yes, it's a part of a longer film called Montréal vu par, which was released for the 400th anniversary of the founding of Montréal in Canada, featuring 6 pieces by well-known Canadian directors. And one of them, Patricia Rozema, directed this, this Desperanto, which relates the experience of a naive Toronto woman, so a woman from an English-speaking area of Canada, who comes on holiday to Montréal expecting excitement and romance and things that are French. Both these films thematize language in different ways. They both use subtitles to mediate these languages, and so we can identify at once 2 levels to the film's language work. We've got source languages in each case and target languages. So for My Name is Yu Ming, the film is shot in Mandarin, English and Irish, and the Mandarin and Irish has English subtitles. For the Desperanto, it's shot in English and French, and the French has English subtitles, and sometimes the English has French subtitles. So this is already an unusual situation for translation, because instead of dealing with an original language and a translated language, we have multiple languages. So the central binary definition of translation seems somehow put in question. So Newmark in 1976, Peter Newmark defines translation as a craft consisting in the attempt to replace a written message or statement in one language by the same message in another language. So there's one language. Same last year with Jeremy Mundy in the new edition of his Introducing Translation Studies. He says the process of translation involves the changing of a text in the original verbal language into a different verbal language. And Raina Meilertz, the Belgian scholar, has summarized the situation when she says with some frustration that implicitly or explicitly translation is still thought of as a full transposition of one source code into another target code, both monolingual, for the benefit of a monolingual target public. Now we know that target publics don't tend to be monolingual, maybe in England, maybe in the English-speaking countries, maybe a little more. But in many other countries, bilingualism or multilingualism is a norm. So, okay, and I would say for film, it's also a norm. This research comes out of a project I did for a book a couple of years ago, where I was looking at how foreign languages are treated in film and how translation helps to address this. And so I had to find examples of very monolingual films and very multilingual films. And I had no problem finding multilingual films. And I don't think I found a single film which had no trace, no quoted word, no borrowed word, no funny accent, no something, some trace of foreign language in it. So film is, I would say, it is treated in the industry and by translators as if it was one language, each film was in one language. But I would challenge you, the next film you watch, to see, is it really only in one language and no trace of anything else? Okay, we're going to skip Jakobsen because he's a bit dry. Okay, we can come back to Jakobsen if you are burning with enthusiasm to do so at the end. Yes, I would move on to just briefly mention a theorist who I find very, very interesting, Naoki Sakai, a Japanese scholar who works in the United States, who has addressed the issue of monolingual and multilingualism in an article called How Do We Count a Language from 2009. We normally think that we inherit the myth of Babel. We think that translation exists because there are many languages and so we have to translate. Sakai says no. We have many languages because we translate. It is in translation that we draw the boundaries between one language and another. And he's of course talking about the Chinese and Japanese tradition, where there is a there are very complex relationships between written and spoken forms and linguistic development. But I think it's also interesting for something as trivial as if you watch on television a news clip and there's somebody who's quoted who comes from a different area of the country, and they have a strong accent and they have subtitles. You do this in England. If somebody with a very heavy Scottish accent could have subtitles on British television, and you will always get letters to the papers and letters to the BBC. This is wrong. They are speaking our language, and you are translating them, and that's racist, whatever. So it's, I mean, what's interesting here is that those subtitles draw the boundary. Those subtitles actually are saying, in this case, right now, this is a different language. So translation generates the foreignness of language. So I think it's a nice idea. So Sakai argues that the unity of language is just a regulative idea. It organizes knowledge, but empirically it struggles to stand up. And I think that the language of film works in a single way. For convenience, we posit that a film has one language. You can buy a film in the original language or with dubbing in a language, but in practice, the language escape is much more complex. Okay, so we know that national and cultural identity is heavily invested in the idea of national language policies, discrete languages. So in France, for instance, an enormous investment was made in a monolingual state policy where everybody had to learn to speak a standard form of French. Historically, regional language varieties have been treated harshly. So thinking about France, thinking about Spain, both Ireland and Canada, for historical and colonial reasons, have two official languages, Irish and English in Ireland, French and English in Canada. And this is part of these films we're going to look at. So in My Name is Yu Ming, we have a young Chinese man who's bored with his humdrum life in China, and he decides to move to Ireland. He spends 6 months with an audio course in the library in China, only to arrive in Dublin to find that nobody knows what he's saying. For those of you who may not have been to Ireland, the Irish language, also known as Gaelic, is spoken as an everyday language by only a few thousand people in the rural west of the country. But the language is officially everywhere. It's on the signs, it's in the official documents. The European Union spends millions a year to translate documents into Irish, which it's not clear if anybody ever reads. Most Irish people learn the language for 10 years or more, but have little or no conversational competence, as you'll see. So Yu Ming, My Name is Yu Ming, is an exploration of the paradoxes of this official national language which is barely spoken, and it invokes the issue of how the role of Irish is problematic in a context where many of the country's population is now migrant. And this is very recent for us, 10 years since we started having inward immigration into Ireland. So the film rehearses the fantasy of the renewal of Irish through the interest of incoming learners, and thus acts in a way as a metaphor for integration. I'd like you to play you a short clip from the film, which is the moment when Yu Ming first meets somebody that he can speak to in Irish. Now, this is complicated by the fact that for technical reasons, the clip that I'm going to show you is subtitled in German. So those of you who speak German will have a marked advantage. Those of you who don't speak German, I will invite to listen to the language of the clip and to hear the transitions between the two languages. So Yu Ming has come into a pub in the middle of Dublin to look for work. He's very depressed because he hasn't yet found anybody in Ireland that he can talk to, and he's feeling very embarrassed about the level of his language ability. Okay, I'm hoping you're going to be able to see him at least a little bit, so we see how we go.
Jim, sleep my time. What? Sleep? Tommy Lord Auburn. Say again? Tommy Lord Auburn.
No, no Lord Auburn. What was the letter Todd's do instead?
Brommer not from the great Hunt made your heaven in a. No, I'm sorry. Don't understand anything you're saying. What do you want to drink? Guinness. Huh? It's good. It's Irish. Huh?
6 years or what? Agus can I make up quick? How does that fit?
You mean the phantom? How did may name on chin?
Yeah. Agus lovely until Glenga.
Don't may on tango ma, but what them vague and holy in hell. Ah, never quit gator go ma. Me higgin any card of them.
Sean, 2 points, please.
Yeah.
Caught my shady from gator. What captain go platoon Bader enough mean is my
Tom, great get his father, but no, he quit this more deal as a here show.
Me higgin.
Lorita Bella on show.
Bella.
Bella. Oh, Hasna.
Nila Vita Gaelica.
Nilorita.
I got forward.
Well, Tom Tiana own not Nilorita, a group like Yanton there.
Here, did you know that?
Oh no! My punch. Okay. Yes. Sorry. Did you know that El Paddy could speak Chinese? Was that last time? Okay. So what we have in that conversation is Yu Ming discovering that he has an interlocutor and having it gently explained to him that in Ireland nobody speaks Irish and everyone speaks English, and his Irish is better than almost everybody else's in Ireland. Yes. And we're going to come back to the question of the German subtitles because they're also relevant for our discussion. But as we can see, the subtitles function as a way, as we can't see, as we would have seen, the subtitles function as a way of allowing English speakers, in this case German speakers, to access the Irish dialogue. And earlier in the film, they also allowed us to access the Chinese dialogue. So it marks It marks a national perspective from which the film is shot, so the imagined audience is an English-speaking audience. The subtitles also allow us to recover other meanings and intertextualities from the film. As Yu Ming painstakingly learns Irish, he practices speaking to himself in the mirror. And the line he chooses is another famous line spoken to the mirror, which is Robert De Niro's line from the film Taxi Driver, "Are you talking to me?" An Tusa ag Larrat Lumsa. The irony is that Yu Ming will get to Ireland and discover that he is the only one here, the only person who's speaking Irish. The scene is set up so that it speaks to an audience who are familiar with popular culture, familiar with the film Taxi Driver. But the subtitles also underline the intertextuality by directly quoting the film in a way which is immediately recognizable to the audience. And the final shot of the film is even more relevant to our discussion. Here, subtitles act to produce a strong moment of specific cultural identity, which isn't connected to the source language which the subtitles are translating. Yu Ming finally finds his home in the west of Ireland, in a pub in an Irish-speaking area, where he welcomes visitors and tourists to Connemara. So, there's him talking to the mirror, and here is him in the pub, "Welcome to Connemara. Cunas Thórshiv" is what he says. Cunas Thórshiv, how are you? This is subtitled, "How are ye?" Now, Cunas Thórshiv is standard Irish. It just means, how are you? How are ye is a Hiberno form of English. So those of you, again, who are familiar with Irish English will know that although in standard English there's no differentiation between second person singular and plural, it's you and you, in Ireland it is distinguished. There's a rural form and an urban form. So in urban areas, you singular can be yous plural, or various spellings, and in rural areas, you becomes ye. So that we do have a plural form in Irish English. And the inclusion of this specific form in the subtitle means that Yu Ming's fluency is doubly articulated. He's not only fluent in Irish, he's fluent in Hiberno English. And the film achieves the culmination of this language fantasy, which is complete cultural assimilation and belonging. And Luke Gibbons has argued that, in fact, the thing which marks his belonging is not the fact that he can speak Irish at all, it's the openness and welcoming. which is in fact the moment of cultural rather than linguistic assimilation, which we could debate, but I'm not going to. Okay, so let's go back to these pesky German subtitles. The reason they're here at all is because here we have a film designed to be shown to English speakers, and I was interested to see what happens when we subtitle that film for speakers who are not speaking Irish, Chinese, or English. And what happens is, in this scene, what do you want to drink? The key moment in this scene is the language shift, lad, I'll buy you a drink. In Irish. And in the German subtitle version, that's gone. That moment of language transition is gone. And if you don't hear the difference, if you aren't familiar enough with one of the languages to hear the difference, then you can't retrieve that from the film at all. And the main point of the film is lost. So there's something here about subtitling not being able to cope with multilingual dialogue in film. Subtitling is technically fails as a translating function at this moment. You could imagine it might do something with different colors or different fonts or italic versus plain text or something, but it doesn't, and so the film is potentially compromised. In practice, a lot of people will probably pick up anyway on what happens because it's very heavily signposted in the way that the film is made. Okay, so that's one problem with subtitling. And this isn't, the orderliness, the predictability, the consistency which makes subtitling such an effective mode of translation here means that it is less effective. It actively makes it, it puts it at a disadvantage when rendering this multilingual film. Okay, so we're now going to look at another example of a film where subtitles constitute an intrinsic reflection on the idea of national identity. And this is our Desperanto, Montréal vu par. And we have Sheila McCarthy. Let's see, okay, we'll bring on Sheila McCarthy in a moment. Sheila McCarthy plays Anne Stewart, who is this housewife from Toronto, who has saved up, there is no film clip here, by the way, so, yeah, but thank you. I just have shots, but for technical reasons. Thank you. So Sheila McCarthy is Anne Stewart. She's saved all year to come to Montreal. She's full of received ideas about Francophone culture, and as the film's title suggests, she is desperate, and she is also linguistically incompetent. She doesn't speak French. She has a phrase book. So, as Philip Schlesinger has put it, nationality can be considered an objective function of communicative competence and belonging. In other words, you need a common language to have a feeling of identity and community. Anne doesn't speak French, so she can't belong. Longing for romance, she gatecrashes a party and misreads a series of conversations, finally realizes that she's made a complete fool of herself, and pretends to faint so that she has a moment to collect herself and work out how she's going to get out of this excruciating, it really is excruciating situation. While fainted, she has an out-of-body experience in which she suddenly finds herself able to overhear and understand the language around her because she can see the subtitles to the dialogue. So I'm just going to show you some shots from this scene where Anne sees the subtitles to the French dialogue around her. So, okay, this is not a brilliant quality but this is her in the white dress with a really silly sort of Cinderella, faux Cinderella costume. And this is the first time she's looking down at that subtitle. And you can tell that the subtitle is doing something unusual because she's standing in front of it. Oh yeah. I don't want to live 5 years out of a suitcase, and we assume that it says 5 years because we can't actually see it. So she sees the subtitle. And then she gets intrigued, so she starts looking at these subtitles more closely. You know that I love, we presume, you. Not only can she see the subtitles, she can touch the subtitles. So she picks up the subtitle, and then she decides that she can rearrange the subtitles. They would look better on one line than on 2 lines. They're inappropriately spaced on the screen. So here we have a subtitle that says, "Oh, marvelous." We know it says, "Oh, marvelous," because we're then shown a shot of her picking it up and breaking it into two, and she puts one bit down her dress, and she puts the other into her glass of wine, and she drinks it. Okay, so what's happening here? Could we have the lights back? So, yes, I think the other subtitles are easier to see. Okay, so this is not an uncommon device in film. There are lots of parodic films where characters can see their own subtitles. I think the earliest example I've seen is from the 40s, Bugs Bunny. There's a Bugs Bunny skit in Hawaii where the characters can see subtitles. So it's an existing trope in film, and here Azima is playing with it in a very extended way. So the character is interacting ever more playfully with the subtitles. How do we account for this? How do we analyze this? It's more than a sight gag. Normally in films it's just a momentary, it's there, it's gone. Bugsy Malone is one of them. Austin Powers' Goldmember, I think, has some subtitles that characters can see, but it's just a joke and it's gone. Here, it seems thematically really linked into what the film is trying to tell us. So narratively speaking, it doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't change what happens to her. It doesn't change her situation. When she wakes up, it's not going to solve her French-speaking problem. But what it does draw our attention to is that, in fact, the director has been playing with subtitles throughout the film. So earlier in the film, Anne watches a film by Denis Sarcon, one of the other filmmakers in this project, a very well-known film called The Collapse of the American Empire, The Fall of the American Empire. So she's watching a subtitled film within the frame. When she arrives at the party, there are some subtle little subtitles which sit in different places on the screen. They respond to the location of characters in the shot. And most interestingly, the directionality of translation changes in the course of the film. So from a French dialogue with English subtitles, we have English dialogue with French subtitles. And suddenly our whole idea of an assumed audience disappears, because we had been assuming that this was a film made by an English-speaking filmmaker for an English-speaking public. But no, this is being made for a public who appreciate both languages. So here we're face to face with something which I think we can consider as a dress. Who is the audience? Who is the act of communication addressed to? In My Name is Yuming, it's very clear. In Desperanto, it's, I would say, an example of what Naoki Sakai has called heterolingual address. He distinguishes between what he calls homolingual address, which makes limiting assumptions about the languages of speakers, and heterolingual address, which doesn't assume. So, in other words, a homolingual address can happen across languages, it can happen in translation, but it assumes a homogeneous language community. Heterolingual address is ready to be surprised. It is trying to accommodate, it is trying to be open to the idea of unexpected language competence. So Naoki Sakai argues that unless the terms in which we represent to ourselves what we do in translation are fundamentally reorganized, we will continue to figure it as a tritely heroic and exceptional act of some arbitrator in the middle, bridging two separate communities, instead of drawing attention to the aspects of translation in which translation is a hybridizing instance. In other words, we don't usually translate between two cultures who have no contact, or two languages which have never had any contact. We tend to translate with languages or in cultures who to some extent speak to each other. And this is something which heterolingual address takes into account. So the assumption that we are speaking from one language to another language is something which in today's migrant and hybrid world can no longer be taken for granted. So I would say the idea of cultural identity shown in these two films is very different. In Yuming is Anamdam, the assumption of a common ethnic background and the vexed relationship between Irish ethnicity and language is necessary for the appreciation of the moment when Paddy speaks Chinese. At the same time, the film is accessible to a wider public. In Desperanto, it's more complex. What is depicted is not the wish to integrate, to belong. It's the wish, it's the tourist wish. She's a tourist. She wants a momentary adventure and then to go home. She doesn't actually, she's not seeking, it's a temporary welcome she's seeking. The subtitles underscore the linguistic risks of such situation and also illustrate an important distinction drawn again by Sakai between addressing and communicating. These subtitles don't translate. They are addressed to an audience which doesn't need translation. They're addressed to a bilingual audience which understands everything in the film. So they're not communicative, but the hybrid audience they address is one which can respond to the larger questions raised by these playful, subversive subtitles. So, this is my conclusion. What can we conclude from these very hasty reading of these two films, which are much richer than I have given you the impression of? I hope to have shown that subtitling can in different ways be a site where the pressures and interests of national and cultural identity are played out in translation. And at the same time, I hope to have shown how subtitles struggle for technical procedural reasons to do justice to those complexities. At the same time, we can see that subtitles have the potential for play and experiment, which is not taken advantage of in almost all subtitled film. So these examples warn us against too easy an acceptance of the role of subtitles as a mode of translation. We might begin to question some of our assumptions about the ontological status of subtitles. Do they constitute a form of access to an unaltered source text, an innocent source text which predates the subtitles and to which they are added just as a form of translation? Do they maintain a stable textual, paratextual relationship with the film? No, I think we've seen they can themselves be an intrinsic part of the film. They can shift, their relationship with the film can shift in the course of a film to fulfill different functions. Are they transparent? Can we simply say that everything that's of interest is happening behind the subtitles? No, again in the case of Yu Ming, where Hiberno-English intrudes into the language of the subtitles, we can say that here the word choices in subtitles have their own ideological weight above and beyond their relationship to any presumed source language. So this is clearly an idea which deserves, I think it's an area which deserves further research, notably in the search for more material, for more filmmakers who are working experimentally with subtitles, more multilingual films in translation. For the moment, I would like to conclude by arguing with the Irish scholar Michael Cronin, also known as Micheál Cronin, in his book Translation and Identity, that these two examples of language fantasy that we've looked at illustrate the extent to which translation is central to the negotiation of identity in a fractured world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Carol. And we have time for a few questions, I think. The next thing is 3:30, isn't it? Yeah, so we have plenty of time, but we better keep the time. Yeah?
One question. Why must we assume that Esperanto was intended for an audience that could speak both languages? How could it, maybe it was intended for people that could speak either one language or the other. Because, if you're watching it and if you can't speak English, then you're going to use the French subtitles. And if you're watching it and you can only speak French, then you're going to use the English subtitles.
It's an excellent point, yes. There is more information which I didn't actually include in the talk. One of the reasons I found this film really difficult to work with was because I couldn't understand what happened at the end. At the end, she's rescued from her fate by two paramedics who take her away and dance with her on the roof. But the two paramedics, she recognizes them. And I couldn't work out why she recognized them until I worked out that they were Denis Safran, the director, and the star of the film, The Fall of the Roman Empire, of the American Empire, which she was watching earlier in the film. And only a Canadian audience, realistically, is going to have facial recognition of those characters. So maybe I would say perhaps not aimed at a bilingual audience, but only aimed at a Canadian audience. It is a film which is very unsatisfying to watch without that information, because that is the entire last 5 minutes of the film. So yeah, but you're quite right, yes, it's a sloppy expression.
The one example of playing around with subtitles a lot of people, I'm sure, are familiar with, is the Hitler spoof, which went viral a couple of years ago. this is the film, I can't remember the name.
Downfall.
The Downfall of Hitler, which I think the original, several years ago, wasn't it? Because the original, when Hillary Clinton, the original one is satirizing Hillary Clinton not getting the Democratic nomination and using the Hitler spoof. This is The Downfall of Hitler, which was subtitled as if it were Hillary Clinton complaining and going mad about not getting the Democratic nomination. It went absolutely viral with a large number of other different people putting subtitles about the crazy man Hitler going crazy about some incident. One of the funniest I saw was Hitler going absolutely mad to the other Nazi officers, his teachers, because he failed to get into Uspi Medicina. And the other Nazi officers were his teachers, and of course he was telling them off going mad with them because they hadn't taught him properly. You might still find it, certainly you'll find other versions on YouTube.
Yes, there's a very nice one where Hitler discovers that Ryanair no longer flies to Berlin, which so yes. Anyway, so yeah, I think it's a nice thing to mention, because what we see is with subtitling is areas where there's tremendous play and experimentation. There's fan subbing. People are doing their own subtitling of their favorite TV shows. People are putting joke subtitles on popular celebrities. And particularly in the area of Japanese animation, there's experimentation in how we can bring across cultures through subtitling in the most effective way possible. And at the same time, in the subtitling industry, there's tremendous resistance to the idea of innovation. It innovates very, very slowly. And this is something which a number of scholars are talking about. I know that one Irish researcher is subtitling a Spanish film with different fonts for the different characters and different colors for the different characters, and playing it to audiences to see whether, in fact, this is a way in which we would enjoy watching film, or if it's something which is cognitively too difficult for us to manage. Because the assumption is anything that is unexpected in a subtitle makes us go, what? And slows us reading and affects our enjoyment of the program.
Well, technically you can do so much.
There are films. I mean, I don't know if any of you saw Man on Fire, Tony Scott, Denzel Washington as a revengeful bodyguard. No, it's awful. I don't recommend it, but it's very, very interesting. The subtitle plays with the depth of field. Subtitles go back into the film. Characters walk in front of them. There was a Russian film called Night Watch, which was subtitled in English with very inventive subtitles as well. So it's out there, but it's marginal. It's very, very peripheral.
I can mention the work done by Vera Santiago, Jan Franco on subtitles, slower subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, for whom Portuguese in Brazil is, for most of them, is a second language. Some of them don't have that good reading skills, so slower subtitles.
And of course, subtitles for would also be, you've got colours, you've got more functionality in that kind of subtitling as well.
And then I had a few years ago, it's not a bit crazy now, when Venuti was all the craze, somebody in Santa Catarina did a dissertation or a thesis on foreignizing subtitles.
I mean, yes, that's. I think that must have been drawing on Marcus Norn. There is somebody who took up this idea of Venuti's idea of foreignizing in relation to subtitling, particularly with Japanese, and he argues that the fact that subtitles are unobtrusive makes them very, very dangerous. He calls them corrupt. He says, if you think it's basically what McDougall says, only it's not as elegant. He says if you see subtitles that you don't notice, you believe you have access to something to which you don't have access. There are things you're not picking up because they're not in the subtitles, or because they're rendered in a way which masks them. What he thinks is that we should all be watching, aware all the time that we're watching subtitles. As Venuti says, we must always be aware that we're reading a translation, and so subtitles should make it difficult for us. Kind of like a Brechtian alienation effect. In practice, I'm not sure we want to spend our Friday night in the cinema experiencing Brechtian alienation effects. So it's a pragmatically problematic approach.
Yep.
I don't know how common that is in Ireland, but here in Brazil we have a lot of pirate subtitling going on, and I find sometimes that we doubt those subtitles more often than not, especially because there are some mistakes in them. It's usually people who watch the film who do the subtitling. So would you find that, well, in the case of non-realist movies and series, be it sci-fi or fantasy, where you have invented languages like Dothraki or Star Trek or whatever, sometimes I find mistakes, and then that makes me doubt if the original translation is as bad as, you know, they've done, because I can see it written down.
Yeah.
And then I can see the translation into Portuguese, and I say, this is not very good, is it? So do you think that puts into question this difference between the languages more clearly, since it's happening?
I absolutely agree with you. I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, there are several things I think in your question. One is that that yes, these are useful because they remind us not to trust subtitles. I think, may I just look up something? I have something here which might be relevant. Actually, no, I might find it later. I'm not sure it's on this memory stick. But we're also seeing non-trustworthy subtitles as a commodity now for certain genres, so not realist genres. And particularly in regard to Asian film, you know, sort of very schlock films, zombie films, horror films. I'm thinking of something called Bio Zombie, which came out in Hong Kong, film shot in Cantonese, and it came out on DVD with 2 sets of subtitles. One is subtitles if you want to understand what's happening in the film, and the other is the original subtitles that were released on a previous DVD. And you can literally, you can watch, you can switch, what they're called English subtitles, and you can hop from one to the other, and literally the same shot will say the opposite thing in the 2 sets of subtitles. It's very, very nice, and I might be able to find some examples if it interests you. So that, I think, we're seeing that as a DVD extra. You know, come and watch the kooky former translation. The implication, of course, is that our new translation is much better. You know, our new translation is fine. But of course, the new translation is only ever one more translation, one more possible translation. It's never definitive. And another area which is interesting is at the other end of the market in prestige cinema. There's a company called the Criterion Collection who release very high-end American DVDs of the great classics of world cinema, and they always say new and improved subtitles. You know, once you've got to the 6th or 7th set of subtitles, how much more improved can they be? You know, at what point, you know, can you start improving them? And in one very nice instance, which was also a Kurosawa film, which was Throne of Blood, the adaptation of Macbeth that Kurosawa did, they released a disc with 2 sets of subtitles with named subtitlers. So Donald Ritchie and Linda Hoagland are both very distinguished subtitlers from Japanese. And they said, we cannot say that one version is better than the other, but Donald Ritchie is very fluent, very accessible. Linda Hoagland is very archaic. She's trying to reflect the Shakespearean language. So we're going to give you both, and a little essay on them and their concept of their subtitles, and then you can watch whichever one you prefer. So this is a really nice, you know, I think it's a marginal practice, but it shows that there is an awareness growing of translation and the fact that it's not just transparent and instrumental. It's you know, it's potentially throws, as you say, a lot of things into question.
A couple minutes more. Another comment?
Okay, yes, I think this is the sequel to Yuming is Hanamdam, possibly. But yes, you're quite right that it's a film very much of its moment. It reflects a particular cultural configuration which is arguably already, you know, already over in Ireland.
I heard something rather similar. A friend of mine, a professor from Univ, a number of people, you know, Raja, was telling me about, I think a professor of his back in Delhi, India, who was going to a conference in Oxford on Anglo-Saxon. He assumed that the conference, the language of the conference would be Anglo-Saxon. He was very disappointed when he found it was contemporary English. This similar kind of naivety, the leopold and crocodile Dundee.
And what does it say about our attitudes to language competence? You know, I think there is more that could be unpacked, I think, in these narratives.
Okay, any more comments or questions? And just like to thank Carol very much, and mention again the lecture we shall be giving next Wednesday afternoon in realizada on the publisher, translator Henry Vaughan, very, very successful Victorian translator, and his censored translation of the Cascio will be the subject of the book. Next Wednesday afternoon, realizada at 2 o'clock. If any of you, some of you here, a lot of you here get messages about events on translation through Trad Info. If anybody doesn't, would like to get these messages on new books, conferences, events in Brazil and outside Brazil, just give me your email address written very clearly, and I send you an invitation. A lot of people here get these messages. If you don't and like to get them, just give me your address. Okay, thank you very much, Carol.